Okay, folks, as in the introduction, I started my company a couple of years ago, DSW Enterprises and Consulting. It's not a fancy DSW, it's just Donald Scott Walker. And it was in an effort to go back to focusing on my passion, which was foliar nutrition, soil and plant applied. And of course, in the early 2000s, I was introduced to some biologicals, and that sort of took my focus going forward. So without taking too much time, I'll just move ahead a little quicker here. So essentially, what it's really evolved into over the last couple of decades is a research and study and the development of biologicals and biostimulants. How do we recognize them? And a keynote as well, a lot of the replicated work that I've had performed, and that's how I was introduced to Josh and his crew, is how do we show how these materials can generate the greatest ROI from the benefits of their use? Whether that's long-term, short-term, or how we look at the ROI is important to everybody's operation. It's always broken down differently. But in my travels, as I've gone here and there around the world to identify some of the biologicals, Europe is way ahead of us at one point. We're catching up rapidly. And they developed about 2012 the European Biological Industry Council. And that was to work as a governing body to oversee the registration and introduction and the scientific research requirements into biologicals and biostimulants. Now, as we saw earlier today, how Dr. Bill Hammond had introduced an idea what the stimulants look like in Europe and the US. Once again, this is a really important slide that I want to stress that a lot of countries have focused on the term biologicals and biological stimulants. And in the early years in the onslaught of the registration process and the scientific data requirements, it sort of got pretty gray and it was really hard to navigate initially. So here in Canada, it took us a few years, but the CFIA just have concluded what they I guess they would make a definitive decision as to call it a supplement as opposed to putting it under an umbrella of biologicals because we have so many supplements in our Fertilizer Act already. So basically, it means any substance or mixture of substances that, other than a fertilizer that's manufactured, sold, or represented in the use of improvement of physical conditions of soil and or to plant growth or crop yields. Anytime that you've got a product where you're trying to generate a comment, how it influences anything, whether it's biotic stress or whether it's immune systems that it brings on naturally, these are required registration to the CFIA. As was mentioned earlier, I'm working with a crew of people that have put together a number of working groups and stuff to consult with the CFIA to homogenize the whole industry response. Now, one of the main reasons that we've had to develop these governing bodies to oversee these supplements or biologicals or biological stimulants is because in the manufacturing world, you can see from this slide, the investments are significant. This is an industry that is growing by leaps and bounds. I don't know what the most recent number is, but we're well into the billions of dollars of investment. I know at the last World Congress I was at, that happened to be held in Spain, they were talking about developing another 10 different plants in the southern US, strictly there in the developmental process of biologicals and biostimulants. And they're not all being developed by mainline companies. There's a number of small players in this world, and that's exactly where the advanced ag crew fit in. And John Wong, where they're at the head of the curve, and yet they're not the big, large companies like BASF, Syngenta, and BioAg, and all these different companies. There's a great number of small independent companies like Advanced Ag who have some of the very best of products. And I know in my travels, I often run into this situation where, well, they're not very big. How can they be important? Or you're just Scotty Walker, a soil shuffler. How do I know that what you're introducing is important? Well, when actual fact, I don't know if it has anything to do with size anymore. I think it has a lot to do with just your ideal focus. Chef, it doesn't seem as though I've been able to take control of my screen again here. Thank you. You saw this come up on Joel's slide, and I really like this slide. I've seen it a few times, so I took a picture of it. It's been cropped a little bit, but one of the reasons I use this photograph is it's have this hat here. And as we get involved in all these various presentations like today, it's like, oh my goodness, There's just so much information. It's almost like overload. But the key thing here, like Joel has expressed, that we so often look at these kind of things and these contributing factors. Next slide, please. Is that we forget about what's going on underneath the ground. My golly, Shiv, I cannot share my screen while other participants are sharing. There we go. Okay, dokie. Shiv, I just ask you to change it when I'm ready. One of the key factors of this slide isn't the names of all the elements on the far right. It's really to explain the influence that we can have with using groups of biologics like the ACFSR or a biostimulant like lignogel. As I want to point out to you here, these two small blue bars and these two small red bars, right? You can see that the red bars go small all of a sudden when the crop goes bolting. So that means those exudates that Joel was talking about, they change. And I know from some work I did about 4 years and 5 years ago where I identified a certain package of materials with a lignogel, I can actually drive exudates through canola root systems that would push away on the possibility of sclerotinia, particularly sclerotinia stem mold in this work that I did. So if it were, for instance, if I was able to drive the population of these blue bars through the roof for a short period of time, as I went into bolting, I can drive exudates to push back against the development of those sclerotia bodies that are going to turn into an infection of the crop. I've pursued this scientifically in the science community, but like many of the presenters today have said, there's so many elements coming to light these days that nobody knows exactly which ones to track. But I want you to know that these are exciting opportunities because it's beginning to really unfold in a major way. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, you'll see this slide on either side at the bottom. It says, reduce use of pesticides, reduce dependence on fertilizer. Now, I don't want you to think I'm of the adage because I come from organic farming way back when, that I want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's not the goal. The goal here is to be able to make a transition as we take on this whole new paradigm shift that we hear about, creating this regenerative farming so we're more sustainable in an effort to reduce the use of pesticides and fertilizers. Not that we're going to eliminate them overnight, but as we focus on what we can see today, and we're understanding from the impact of what's going on in the soil rhizosphere, that's where we can have our greatest influence. And I've got some photographs to show you, like, what does that mean and how do we get this forward? Because on the world stage, for instance, in India, they've been farming areas of those countries in the Middle East for decades, if not millenniums. And the soil is very tired and very used. And in an effort to be able to maintain the rainfalls of monsoons in regions, because it'll immediately go dry. So how they've been able to regenerate these soils? By using biologicals. And these are things that are happening around the world. And now the stories are coming out that some of these monsoon rains aren't making it to the rivers. And that means now they're dealing with communities downriver that aren't having supplies of water for their villages. So where there's one implication, there's another spin-off down the road. Next slide, please. So as we all can consider this, and I've had this in my presentation for a number of years because it's a great pictorial, we're always looking at what we can see above ground. And we forget so often about the soil environment and the impact it's got. And all the presentations today have been exactly that. What implications can I have today to impact that rhizosphere around that soil zone? That's really where we're going to with this. So can I have the next slide, please? So as I've pursued all these different things where I'll go to a World Congress, be in Italy or Spain or the US, whatever, I look for these types of biologicals so that I can test them. And I put them into replicated plots and I look for research money to get support. And of course, they're looking for market share. You'd be amazed when I was at the last one. Every time I mentioned I was from Western Canada, their eyes would just light up and they go, oh, you're big. Well, of course, it's a 63 million acre pool of opportunity when the world looks at Western Canada. And growers that are on this call or those involved heavily will all appreciate everybody and their dog has come to Western Canada lately and we're inundated. And that's why I'm always leaning on data and the right data. Make the choice to pursue a product and do some trial work Because look at the number of products that I've tested in just the last 10 years. And there's a multitude of products in those categories. And that's why Bill Hammond and I have become quite acquainted. Is he's one of my favorite go-to research guys to get this kind of work done, because when he does his plot work, those plots are incredibly integrated together that the yield response from one plot from the same treatment is almost identical to the next. And it's a very difficult thing to achieve at the research level. And he's done an incredible job. And I'll bring you to the grouping at the bottom. It says bacteria groupings, one in furrow, which has been the ACF. And there's another one most recently that I picked up from a World Congress called Creotech. And it's a group of biologicals that actually are applied to the foliage that will increase the consumption of nitrogen from the atmosphere. And that's why I get so excited about these things, is it's just getting started as we go along. Next slide, please. We've all seen these materials, and I want to explain where my introduction to the ACF came from. John Wong, I heard him speak about 4 years ago in Alberta. It would be 4 years ago last fall. And what really intrigued me the most is, as I've been trialing and I've been researching and studying these materials, he's the first one, and I have not met anybody yet, internationally or nationally, that has actually spoke of being able to kind of like manipulate the bacteria to respond in a certain way. Not that he's modifying them any, it's just that his selection process is so amazing that there's nobody else that's been able to create these kind of blends or these kind of activities from these particular products. You'll start to recognize Bacillus subtilis at the bottom of that list, and to a lesser extent, Bacillus lynchiformis. There's a boatload of products out there with these particular compounds, but they don't function the same as the ones that John has. And that's really what's got me excited about the ACF format. Next slide, please. So we heard also with Joel talking about the exudates and how we can feed the rhizosphere when we put products and biologicals down into that rhizosphere and generate these functionalities. This is a particular product that I've been helping with a study of for some 16, 17 years. This is a simple circle around predominant area of elevated photosynthesis is all that's identifying. We hear about these exudates, and there are biostimulants that work like a charm that will generate or help the crop generate higher levels of photosynthesis, and that carbon consumption is now processed, turned into cookies and cakes, as some scientists would call them, and feeding that rhizosphere. And what does that mean to a producer? It's really quite simple. Next slide, please. No, I'm missing my picture of the roots of the flax crop. Is it not there? Dear, oh dear, it's gone. Okay, I guess it's not there. That's most unfortunate. So it's gone. Okay, go back to where we were. I guess we got that, pulled that one out, and I didn't notice. So anyway, well, I had a photograph of flax in there, and the biostimulant was put on that crop day one. It was in southern Alberta, so it was irrigated day 2 into day 3. So that's my rain event. That's my keeping my moisture levels where they were. The root system virtually tripled in the matter of 6 days. And a lot of people would assume that the product itself is what generated the root growth. But if you recall from some of the presentations today, is when you drive those exudates into the rhizosphere and you create a high activity of the rhizosphere of the microbiology that's down there, they release all the enzymes and proteins and plant food at the bequest of the plant, and it simply goes on a feeding frenzy and generates an incredible amount of growth. And the same process is occurring when we're applying things like the ACF, because it's creating that environment. And that's why you saw many pictures today of a higher level of root system. And this is simply a picture here to give you an idea of how important it is to start at the trial level, so that when we get to this point, we see the response, we know the ROIs there, we can now take our focus and move it into the fields and expand the opportunities in the ag industry. And then we can start to bring more science on board, and the whole world starts to begin to evolve. Like I've already done some work for John Wong down in North Dakota, testing his chitotrol. And this is going to continue to move around the globe. Next slide, please. So here's a particular quick a shot of once you get established in a research plot, you take it to a field, and you can see we've generated a really nice differentiation of actual bushel yield increase. So we know we're down the path of going down the road of getting some serious ROI. You'll see also the third line down there where it says 0.3985 acres measured. And I'll say this about once, if not 1,000 times. If you're out there in the field and doing strip trials, you need to acquire good data, because if you require bad data, you'll make bad decisions. You need good data for good decisions, and that means taking weights and measures of small areas. Today's headers are extremely large. I very rarely, but sometimes I'll go to 1,000 feet, because that means I'm going to have about an acre in that header if it's a 40 or 45 footer. I like to back that up and do smaller, because it becomes a functionality of how much is it? Is it 5 bushels, or is it 10%? Because 10% of 20 is 2 and 10% of 50 is 5. So if I can attain an opportunity of 10%, 4 out of 5 years, I'm making money. On to the next slide, please. So here's the thing that we saw earlier. I won't hang on to this one. We'll go to the next slide. And we'll go to the next slide because we've seen these ones as well. These are great yields. This one is something I want to explain a little bit about. This is a producer where we're doing field strip trials with the ACF, in furrow, at planting, right? Some was done as topical. But my point here is this. At the beginning of the trial, he didn't tell me that the other end of the section had been manured heavily manured. And as the season progressed, of course, you can imagine all the peas, the far end into that section, the other half, all went flat on his fanny. Down it goes. And yet where it didn't go down, I had a boatload of yield come out of that trial where the ACF was. But because the crop couldn't finish at the other end, I didn't see any yield advantages. And what I'm getting at there is, as you go down the road of applying a lot of manure or a lot of any one particular product, be careful not to overload. A lot of manures are applied from various areas of supply, and those applicators don't want to drive very far. So next thing you know, you'll putting on 10,000 gallons of a pig manure or 10 tons of a cattle manure, and you're overload the field. And we know even after 3 years with this field recognized, it was still way too much, nitrogen in this particular system, and the crop went down. Next slide, please. And these are trials that we can all learn to do. Now, this slide is in there because this is where we took the ACF and it went through a moderately saline area. Everybody's looking for that miracle pill. I want to improve the crop's ability to grow through saline areas. I'll be right up front with you. I've got nothing that works like a charm in white soil yet. There's no miracle for that. But if it's moderately saline, there's a number of materials that we're using today that will improve the plant's ability in that rhizosphere to grow virtually normal. So what I did was I measured the area in the saline pocket where it was treated, and I moved a few header widths to the left of the screen, and I took a strip there outside of the saline area, and the yield was equal. So that tells me I'm having an impact. Here where it was side by side, there was a few bushel gain. Next slide, please. So here's going on to a soybean thing. The remarkable thing about some of these biologicals, and some stimulants for that matter, is the response is not identified early. You can see by the plants laying out there, the response is not very significant. But where the significant really starts to shine is when it starts to branch and go into flowering stages, particularly pulse crops. You'll start to pick up the differentiation there. I remember one time Josh and I were measuring pods and counting beans in them, and we're just ecstatic at the level of improvement. But by golly, sometimes those improvements don't start to show up till further down that crop cycle. Next slide, please. So here you can see a group of us standing in a field. Unfortunately, it's pretty dark in the background, but essentially that was in a pocket of a potato producer in a moderately saline area where the potato production was extremely reduced. You've never been able to grow a half decent crop in there. Now, from what I understand, for the second or third year in a row now, we've been able to get to the point where we can grow a decent crop of these saline pockets that are moderate. And in this particular slide, I have the bottom there where Dr. Bill had done some work on potatoes. And in his work, we showed increases of yield in potatoes of 3,300 pounds and change and as low as 2,200 pounds and change. And that's from 1 or 2 applications of ACF, 2 particularly in the furrow, and then the other trial had also a second application on top. As you move forward with these, it's a question of ROI and where can I reap the greatest benefit. But if we start to see implications of maintaining the back pressure against soil-borne diseases from fluttering up and infecting our crops, I think we'll begin to realize there's more than just the yield and ROI. There's long-term effects. Next slide, please. So here's a hay crop. I saw one of the questions go through earlier about ability to generate better hay crops. Absolutely. The exact timing, where I would say I'm still working on it, but early season growth in the spring at 6 inches, a few days after regrowth and cutting. The reason there's such a dark section here, I sincerely believe that that's the crop's ability to absorb some of the nitrogen out of the air, because it was applied after a decent canopy had recovered, and we can see that there's a greater uptake of nitrogen in here. And then on the left, you can see the substantial yield increase from beginning to end, and there's definitely ROI in treating a hay crop, be it alfalfa like this one or a Timothy crop or anything like that. Go to the next slide, please. So Velocity Green is one of the companies that's the distributor in Eastern Canada, and I've been doing a boatload of consulting with those guys for a year now, where we're introducing it and significantly into the fruit and vegetable industry. Next slide, please. This is a Timothy crop for a hay producer near the village of Wilsonville. The treated and untreated is significantly different. You can see we generated a whole lot more bales. And what makes me grin about this trial is this gentleman, one of the greatest benefits that came out of this is when he breaks the bales apart, they're the small bales to feed his horses. He's got race horses, as it flakes apart beautifully. He just loves the way that the bales break down. The feed value is a whole lot better. He's figuring the way they're feeding, but I always grin about the way the bales break up, regardless of the yield. He loves using it now because of what kind of quality he gets out of the hail. Hey, next, please. Now, this is a slide I'll just give a brief history on. A couple of questions have been asked about, do I apply from one year to the next? And we've heard presenters talk about the soil organic carbon contribution to organic matter. And these types of products will have a major impact in the long term. But with all the moving parts of whether it's an annual crop or a perennial crop or undisturbed for a lengthy time, this bull pasture has not been disturbed for a great number of years. 3 years of ACF at just under 2 gallons twice a year. The next slide, please, and look at the soil sample. You're just going to go, come on, can't be so. What I want to bring to your attention here is look at the organic compound of these trials. And that's after 3 years of application. Yes, it's a homogeneous environment. It's never been worked, but look at the increase in the organic buildup. We've changed that organically considerably. And that's simply by applying the ACF over a 3-year period. Of course, we can look at the phosphorus release and the potash and all the other elements that go with it. But that is really a key point that supports everything these guys have been talking about today. We're all talking about this being a brand new shift. But ladies and gentlemen, this has been going on, as John would say, for decades. We're just getting to the point where it's being accepted, it's being rolled out, and it's all about the money because we can all make money doing it. Next slide, please. So this is in the turf application in golf in Ontario. This was after a great big tournament where all the tee blocks and the golf course had taken a kicking. And this was done in the fall, applied at the beginning of October where temperatures are quite cool. And it still recovered those areas in 14 days. Next slide, please. Here's another one that was done in the springtime. And this is winter injury, and it's snow mold and white mold. And you can see after just 11 days, the level of recovery. It's significant. Next one, please. Then we're looking at the fruit industry. It's uncanny what it's doing in the fruit and vegetable industry. All the fruits that we've been testing and had testimonials that are coming back, there are higher Brix levels in that crop. The berries are more uniform in size. They're more true to flavor. And now I'm attempting to get them to track storageability and shelf life. Because I know if we've had all these kind of impacts, we've got to be having some kind of an impact on the shelf life and storageability. And now not are we looking at yield benefits, but we're also looking at quality of our crops, longevity in the public, the nutrient value going forward. The whole 9 yards is going to start to really expand. What I look forward to in this particular vineyard is what level of winter injury am I going to have? I suspect I will have stored more sugars in those vines that there'll be less winter injury, depending on the season. Next slide, please. So I think I'm pretty well close to the end of my presentation here. I just want to show you that this is another potato root crop. Because it's a soil-borne material and everybody's starting to identify these various qualities, that's a significant yield bump. There's a boatload of money in that particular trial for that grower because that's a sweet potato trial. I'm just looking for opportunities and ways and means of applying this product. How do I get it into that furrow with the seed piece? If I'm dumping down a boatload of fungicides to prevent all these diseases guys are having trouble with? Can I add it to the fertilizer starters? Can I put it with a 1034-0? Can I put it in a separate tank than the fungicides and still put it in there? I know it works like a charm in season going on top of the crop through privets, but how do I move and maneuver around all these other moving parts in the industry to get these types of beneficial products into the furrow? I would much rather be able to work with something like this than a boatload of fungicides, but we're not there yet. It's going to take time. We need to create more data points. We need to create more information like John spoke earlier about doing some rapid testing systems. And that's going to be, I heard him say distinctly, 12 to 24 months out before we have all this work done. So if we're innovators, we got to get on it and we got to get it done ourselves because the benefits in the crop itself and the over long period of time, soil health, as well as our storageability, our shelf life quality, our consumers, it's going to be a lot happier.